morning, everyone. Hey, for those of you who have not yet met, Russ, Lessard, the sales manager here at Berkshire. Pleasure to meet you. So today we're going to go over the Form 22B buyer sale of property contingency. So how many here have actually written an offer or been on the listing end of a contingent offer? 1, 2. So this is kind of a refresher course. And for the rest of you, this is something that's going to be completely brand new. So this is going to be very helpful in the time coming, because in this, if you were gone in this business maybe over the last 6 months, 7 months, chances are you might not have come across a contingent offer. Just because everything was selling so fast, multiple offers, a lot of potential buyers who owned a home were just waiting because they knew they had a little bit less bargaining power going contingent. But with the current market we have now, we are definitely seeing more contingent offers. I've seen a couple, well, more than a few in the last month and a half. So we're going to use this as a refresher, so you'll know exactly what you need to do, whether you're working with a seller and you receive a contingent offer, or if you're working with a buyer writing up a contingent offer. So I do have extra forms here I'm going to pass out. It will be helpful to take notes on these and just use this as your template in the future if you were to write a contingent offer. Yeah. What? So what are some of the reasons why a buyer would write a contingent offer?
Need the down payment funds,
Need the down payment funds, yes.
only move once.
Correct, only move once. Maybe they wouldn't qualify for a loan unless they sell their property. Just the debt to income ratio, another reason. There's quite a few reasons.
Their own home, the other home sells.
Yes. So, as you can see with the form, fill in the date, buyer's name, seller's name, and the property. So as you read contingent on, so your offer is contingent on sale of property. This agreement is contingent on buyer selling buyer's property at, fill in address, city, state. On or before, you'll want to input a date there. So if you do not fill it in, it's 45 days after mutual acceptance of the agreement, the contingency period. Buyer shall list buyer's property for sale on a multiple listing service in the area serving the property with a licensed real estate firm within 5 days of mutual acceptance. If buyer fails to do so, this contingency shall be deemed waived and paragraph 6D shall apply. So that's very important. Make sure your buyer lists the property within 5 days or they're in default and their earnest money is at risk.
Is that common practice to list after you've gotten one of these? And aren't you trying to actively before you, I mean, at the same time, or what's the normal?
I've seen it both ways.
Oh, really?
Yes.
So people are ready to list their house, ready to go, waiting on this to get signed, and then they're like, boom, let's list.
Correct.
And then let's get it sold as fast as possible.
Yes. And
Price to sell.
some buyers will actually get their home on the market maybe a week before.
Okay.
But you'll still want to write this up if you have not received an offer on your property within
Right.
within those days leading up to your current offer.
Could you also, so if the person who's interested in buying hasn't listed their house, could the seller request that they keep it under a certain price to make sure that it does sell?
They can make any request they'd like.
Okay,
A certain price, a seller could ask for a CMA
okay,
on the property prior. So they'll know exactly what's gonna be listed at,
Yes,
and then they'll see what the comparables are. The seller wants to know how quick the contingent property will sell.
yes,
So they can sell their home sooner. And that can be all written on an addendum, or before even accepting the offer, they'll ask to receive that ahead of time.
Okay.
And once they see that, then they'll review the offer presented to them. So either way.
no, that makes complete sense.
So what's a common time frame to fill in on that fourth line under the first paragraph there, the on or before, the 45 days if it's not filled in? This is the whole time for you to then get under contract on your own home to sell, correct?
Correct.
So you're trying to guesstimate, I mean, do people do up to like 60 days or is 45 days the max?
No, it's not the
It's
max.
whatever you put in there.
45 days is the default.
Okay,
I'd say it's common, depending on the market, somewhere between 30 and 60.
okay,
If you're representing the buyer,
Uh-huh.
you might want to go a little bit longer.
of course,
If you're representing the seller, you might want it
you want as short as possible, but
to be shorter.
also reasonable so you don't default the whole deal because they can't get it under contract.
Yeah, it's negotiable.
Okay, of course, doesn't really,
And we'll talk about bump notices as well,
Right.
which is an option with the seller.
Gotcha.
So even if it's a long period of time, that's 60 days,
gotcha,
if the seller does not believe that the contingent house is gonna move,
yeah.
they can send a bump notice.
What if they just get a better offer and the other party is still making a good effort and faking it?
That would be with a bump notice.
Yeah, so you could just bump somebody regardless, I mean, if you have an offer at hand, you could serve a bump notice,
Yes, if you
say,
receive a second offer,
yep.
you will send a bump notice to the contingent buyer.
And that bump notice is just saying you have to take this contingency away and close the deal, or you're getting bumped, is that correct? They have the chance to waive the
Yeah,
contingency.
we'll jump into the bump notice.
Get there.
Yep.
Can I get a copy of the 22B? Sorry, I'm late, thank you.
Let me just backtrack
Sorry.
1 second. So when I said the seller can bump, they would have to receive another offer to bump.
That's, yeah. Yeah.
So that's not a part of this form, though, there's a different form.
Correct, and we'll go over the multiple forms in
Okay,
1
thank you.
second. So actually, go ahead, if you have the form, I'll give you the list of the other forms that could potentially be involved with this. So write down these additional forms. Okay, Form 44, bump notice. Form 46, bump response. Form 90K, contingency property notice.
Wait,
You're ready.
That's Form 90K, contingency property notice.
9-0.
Yes, 90. And one more, 22Q, buyer's pending sale of property contingency. And I'll throw one more in there, which we may or may not get to this form today, would be Form 90L, buyer's request for seller's consent. So with the 22B, there's a lot of other forms that could be involved with the 22B. So just be aware of that. So if buyer has not sold buyer's property or given notice waiving this contingency by the end of the contingency period, then this agreement shall terminate and the earnest money shall be refunded to buyer. On to number 2. When seller's consent is required on buyer's property, buyer must obtain seller's written consent before buyer accepts any offer for the sale of buyer's property that A, is contingent on the sale or closing of that second buyer's property. So on the contingent property, if they receive an offer that is another contingent offer, they have to get the seller's written consent to accept that offer. B has a closing date less than 30 or more than 60 days from the date of mutual acceptance of the offer on buyer's property. So when the buyer receives an offer on their property, they'll have to give notice that it's less than 30 days or more than 60 days for a closing. If buyer accepts any such offer without seller's prior written consent, seller shall have 3 days to terminate this agreement from buyer's notice that the contingency is satisfied, which notice shall include a complete copy of purchase and sale agreement for the sale of buyer's property. And upon seller's termination, buyer shall be in default, and seller shall be entitled to remedies as provided for in the agreement. If seller does not timely terminate, the agreement shall not be affected. Make sense? So with that one, on line 2, that's where the Form 90L could come in place.
Can you give an example?
So if buyer, let's say they accepted an offer that's going to close in 30 days, they would, let's say the contingent offer on buyer's property will close in 25 days. If they did not give notice and get consent from the seller, they could be in default.
Just because it's under 30 days?
Correct.
I do have a question, because it says that the seller has 3 days to terminate, right?
From the notice given.
Terminate from,
Here, it says that the seller shall have 3 days to terminate this agreement from buyer's notice that the contingency is satisfied.
which line are you on?
21.
2, yeah.
Okay, 2.
The second half of line 1. Yeah. So if, for whatever reason, they don't reply in 3 days, then it doesn't affect the buyer?
Correct.
Okay.
So if seller does not timely terminate, the agreement shall not be affected. So they'll keep
Okay.
moving forward.
I just gotta ask,
Yep.
relatively new. So those 3 days, because it's only 3 days, it doesn't include weekends, right?
Correct.
Okay,
Yeah, 5 days or less,
right, okay.
business days. Over 5 days, calendar days. Okay, loan application. If this agreement is contingent on buyer obtaining financing pursuant to Form 22A, buyer shall make written application for the loans defined in Form 22A and pay the application fee if required for the subject property within, either going to check 5 days after mutual acceptance of this agreement, or you're going to check within X amount of days after buyer satisfies the contingency in this addendum for mutual acceptance. Oops, for mutual acceptance if either box checked, if neither box checked. So with that, you're either gonna, your financing contingency will come into play right away, or after you have waived your financing contingent, waived or satisfied.
Quick question on that?
Yes.
The mutual acceptance, does that happen after the contingency is satisfied or when you signed on the contingency?
You'll have mutual acceptance when all parties agree to the initial offer.
Gotcha, so that's the timeline.
Right,
And
but
then,
there's contingencies
Right.
within it.
so in this 3 loan application, you have three different times that it could happen within whatever you fill out, the contingency is agreed or mutual acceptance, if it's not filled out.
So with the financing, so you have to apply for your financing either within 5 days of mutual acceptance
Yep,
or within, let's just say 5 days after buyer satisfies the contingency in this addendum.
yep.
So if they receive an offer
Oh, gotcha.
on the contingent property.
Got it. Sorry, I read that wrong. I got you.
Yes.
What do we consider making written application for a loan? Pre-approval is enough, or is there another step needed after?
Great question. As far as I know, when you apply for that loan.
Okay.
What was the answer?
When you apply for the loan.
Oh, okay.
So what's really interesting here is that this paragraph supersedes the requirements for the 22A.
Yes.
That's,
Yeah, so if buyer's not required to apply for the loan until after satisfaction of this contingency, the timelines in Form 22A shall not begin until that time. And that paragraph 3 supersedes the requirement for a buyer's loan application in Form 22A.
that's important.
Going on to number 4, property remains on market. Seller may keep the property on the market in the contingent status until seller has received notice that buyer has satisfied or waived this contingency. If prior to that time, seller accepts another offer, seller shall give notice to buyer and shall give buyer X amount of days, 5 if not filled in, or by the expiration of the contingency in paragraph 1, whichever is earlier, the bump period, to waive or satisfy this contingency. If buyer does not timely waive or satisfy this contingency, this agreement shall terminate, and the earnest money shall be refunded to buyer. Seller's notice shall be on the bump notice, Form 44, or similar form, and buyer's reply shall be on bump reply, Form 46, or similar form. So seller is going to keep the property on the market. So the status of the property for sale is going to stay contingent. And a lot of times, what I'll see out there is the listing agent will put a sold sign on right when it goes contingent. And I would recommend personally not to put a sold sign up because you want to continue to market that property and get potential buyers in. Even though on the MLS it's showing contingent, when potential buyers drive by, oh, it's sold. Whereas if that sold sign's not there, they're gonna call their agent, hey, I just drove by this property for sale, can you tell me about it? And at that point, their agent will say, it's contingent, but if you're really interested, let's take a look or write an offer. And you can actually bump the first person.
Question then on that. If a buyer's agent puts up their sold sign on your listing, can you take it down?
Yeah, they cannot
Okay.
put one up during contingency. Yeah, because actually, it's not until it's pending, and so it won't be pending until the contingency is,
That's what I got it.
or if there's still an inspection that needs to be done, because it might go pending inspection at that time versus pending. Number 5, contingency satisfied. Buyer shall give notice to seller within 2 days of entering into an agreement to sell buyer's property. Buyer's notice shall include a complete copy of the purchase and sale agreement for the sale of buyer's property. The sale of the property shall close 3 days after the closing of the sale of buyer's property. Buyer's notice shall be on the contingency property notice. That's Form 90K or similar form. Buyer may not extend the closing date for the sale of buyer's property without seller's written consent. So once a buyer has received an offer on their property, they have to let the seller know within 2 days and provide a complete copy. So if they do not do that, they could be in default.
Does it give a timeline for the seller's response to that default? Or is it in that 90K?
Could you repeat that question again?
So if the buyer does not give notice within 2 days of entering an agreement to sell their own property, is that lack of disclosure, can the seller terminate the contract?
They could be in default, they need to give seller notice within 2 days, so yes, they could be in default. They do
And
not-
then if they are in default, is there a time frame that the seller needs to respond by, or else, you know, kind of like
It sounds like they stay in default, like the seller can terminate
at
anytime.
any time, because there's no timeline not to respond? Because the other paragraph said you have to respond within 3 days, right? If the, where is it?
Line 42,
I think we're getting
shall
there.
close 2
Yeah.
days. Oh,
Yeah,
We're
well,
getting there?
yeah, we'll go number 6, or buyer's property failure to close.
Never mind. Hey, there's 2 pages here?
Yeah. Yes, there is.
That's cool.
And they're stapled together, so it should
I
be
I
there.
already threw mine away, I got done with 1 page and I'm done. Yeah, I don't know either. But you know what I'm asking, right?
Yeah, we'll see.
Yep, yeah, we'll
Go ahead.
go back, hold that thought.
Yeah, that's all good. Yeah.
So, buyer's property failure to close. A, notice to seller. Buyer shall give notice to seller within 2 days of learning that the sale of buyer's property has failed. If buyer does not give such timely notice, then buyer shall be in default. Such notice must be given regardless of whether buyer chooses to proceed with this agreement. So if buyer receives an offer on their property and it fails to close, for whatever reason, buyer has to give seller notice within 2 days. Now we're going to go on to B, contingency survives. If the sale of buyer's property fails to close through no fault of buyer before expiration of the contingency period in paragraph 1, then this contingency shall be reinstated until the contingency period has expired. And that contingency period is going to be roughly between the 30 and 60 days unless you agreed otherwise. So let's say you're on day, let's say you had 60 days for your contingency, and on the 45th day, buyer's property failed to close for some reason. You have to give notice within 2 days, and then it just reverts back to your home being active and you're still in a contingent offer.
So you got another 15 days.
You have another 15 days, correct. Short period of time, hopefully I have a
Making
backup.
some phone calls.
yeah.
Better have a price drop.
C, agreement terminates. If the sale of buyer's property fails to close through no fault of buyer after expiration of the contingency period, then this agreement shall terminate and the earnest money shall be refunded to the buyer. D, waiver by buyer. If the sale of buyer's property fails to close through no fault of buyer after the expiration of the contingency period, buyer shall have the option of waiving the contingency and proceeding with the agreement. By waiving this contingency, buyer also waives all other conditions in this agreement, including financing or any other contingency. If buyer waives this contingency, whether after failure of buyer's property to close or otherwise, the sale of property shall close 30 days after buyer's waiver. So if the contingency is waived by the buyer, they're waiving financing, they're waiving inspection. Basically, we're going to closing.
Do you know why that is? If you waive one contingency, you have to waive them all? Is that kind of true throughout all the contingencies?
No,
No, it's just,
yeah, you can waive your financing, but still have an inspection contingency.
gotcha, so it's this one. is the
Without this,
Gotcha, so this one's pretty unique in the fact that if you waive it, you waive everything else.
yes.
There's no other ones like that, I don't.
And that's why you may or may not want to have an inspection after you have mutual acceptance, instead of waiting for your property to sell, so you know up front if there's any major defects with that property. Because if you find a defect, maybe you don't want that property, instead of waiting 45 days out to get an offer on your property.
Well, and it makes sense from the perspective of the seller that if the buyer's saying, I need to sell my house before I can buy yours, and then the buyer says something like, I don't have a buyer for my house, but I'm waiving that and I'm still agreeing to buy your house, that's super risky for the seller, right?
No,
And-
super
and so-
risky for the buyer.
And the buyer,
Well,
but
that's
for the
clear.
seller, it's like, you need to sell your house to continue to buy my house, and you don't have a buyer for yours. So like, the risk is high that the seller's property will go back out on the market. So that's why if the buyer's gonna go this route and waive the contingency, then they're agreeing to waive everything. Because it's a high risk for the seller that the property's gonna come back out on the market.
Yes.
They're both kind of lose.
Yeah, it'd be a lose-lose, but yeah.
Well, on the waiver, the only loser, if there is one, would be the buyer. Because they're waiving it and
Yeah,
they're basically saying they're gonna close on their.
yes, it's a big risk, and I would talk with your client about the pros and cons of waiving that, and let them know they're waiving everything else.
Get their signatures.
The waiver by buyer, new construction, if at the time of buyer's waiver, a certificate of occupancy or its equivalent for the property has not been issued by the applicable government authority, then buyer shall close within X amount of days, 5 days if not filled in, of notice from seller that a certificate of occupancy or equivalent has been issued, or within 30 days of waiver, whichever is later. So just note, on either one, D or E, if you're waiving the contingency, then you're closing within 30 days. That's your closing period. Closing date, the closing date set forth in this addendum shall supersede the closing date set forth in the agreement. So a lot of times on the purchase and sale agreement, front page for closing date, either leave it blank or write in C22B.
Wait, say that again, I'm sorry, I was still thinking about E, sorry.
So on the original purchase sale agreement, front
Yeah.
page for
Yeah.
closing date, you can either leave it blank, or what I would recommend, writing in C22B.
Got it, because you can't really pick a date, because
Yes, because it will be 3 days.
it starts after a certain, yeah.
Yeah, the closing date will be 3 days after buyer's contingency closes. Any other questions on all of that?
Kind of.
Yes.
Why did they make this form when we pretty much already have forms that cover these things individually?
Which one?
The 22B. I mean, don't we already have forms that cover everything in here individually?
Well, this form covers the contingent property of the buyer. So if
Okay.
the buyer has to
Yeah,
sell their
I got
home,
that.
that's what this one
So
covers.
the 90K doesn't cover that?
With the 44 and the 44 or 46,
Yeah,
those are responses.
got it.
So 46, 44,
The notice.
And is 90K a response also? Or is that for contingent?
It's a notice, right?
it's a notice.
Got it, okay.
Can you repeat those four numbers again? that you
Yes.
said that are going on?
Here, I got them written down. If you wanna-
I'll repeat them again.
Thank you.
So the other forms that you might need or come across with the 22B would be Form 44, bump notice, Form 46, bump response, Form 90K, contingency property notice, Form 22Q, buyer's pending sale of property contingency, and Form 90L, buyer's request for seller's consent.
So Russ,
Yes.
if there is, so if I'm representing a buyer and we wanna write an offer on a property that's already contingent, is there a separate form or verbiage that has to go into my purchase and sale that I'm writing on that property that's currently contingent?
Great question. I would have to look through those forms and see,
Okay.
but as far as I know right now, I'm not aware of that. But
Okay.
I'm not saying it's not in there,
Yeah,
I have to go back in.
yeah, cause it seems like if we wrote it and it was signed around, then we'd be under contract with no other stipulations, because that person can choose when they get the bump notice. Who's currently under contract on the contingent property, when they get the bump notice, they could waive it, and then you'd have two buyers in
Right.
contract on the same house.
So with the second buyer, if there is not another form in there, then on a Form 34, you would want to put mutual acceptance subject to
Okay, yeah,
bump of
gotcha.
first buyer. that, make sure there's something in writing so you don't have two offers at the same time, or two accepted offers at the same time. And I'll ask Dave about that. Sure.
Yeah, I guess, do they have to satisfy the bump before they can be mutual on the second offer? I mean, do they have to be
Yeah,
noticed and
well-
satisfied before they?
Well, the first
sign
offer
around?
would have to terminate, and that would be through the bump
Yeah,
notice.
Okay.
Oh, no, we're not.
So they really couldn't accept, I mean, they really couldn't get mutual on the
I
second one
was,
until that was done.
Correct.
That was-
So Form 44, bump notice. Basically it states, seller gives notice that seller has accepted another offer to purchase the property as permitted by the buyer sale of property contingency, Form 22B, unless buyer gives notice before expiration of the bump period that buyer has satisfied or waived the contingency. The agreement shall terminate and the earnest money shall be refunded to buyer. Buyer should use the bump response, Form 46, to respond to this notice. Let me jump up here. Pull up the Form 44.
Well, if you're the first buyer, and then somebody comes in with a bump, what are your options?
We'll go
So
over
waive
those.
your
One
contingency.
second.
Okay.
So waive your contingency.
So here's the Form 44 bump notice, which I just read. And now I'm going to jump over to Form 46. Bump reply. Okay, so in response to notice that seller has accepted another offer to purchase the property, buyer gives notice as follows. Number one, buyer's property is sold, contingency satisfied, buyer has accepted an offer to sell buyer's property that is not contingent on the sale or closing of another property, and that will close no less than 30 days and no more than 60 days from the date buyer accepted the offer or otherwise consented to by seller. Next box, buyer's property not sold, contingency waived. Buyer has not accepted an offer to sell buyer's property. However, buyer waives the contingency in buyer's sale of property contingency addendum, Form 22B. Buyer understands that by waiving this contingency, buyer waives all other contingencies in the agreement, including inspection, financing, etc. Buyer's property not sold, agreement terminated. Buyer has not accepted an offer to sell buyer's property. The agreement is terminated and the earnest money shall be refunded to buyer. So if you're representing the buyer, once you receive the bump notice, these are your three choices. Especially if you're waiving the contingency, make sure your buyer knows exactly what they're getting into. Any questions on the bump notice or bump response? Pretty self-explanatory. Just make sure if buyer is waiving the contingency, just make sure that they know they're waiving the financing portion and the inspection portion as well.
I guess I do have a question. On the bump notice, paragraph 4 on 22B, can you request more than 5 days? I mean, it's blank.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just if you do not fill it in, it's automatically 5 days.
All right.
You want 2 days, you want 7 days, it's negotiable.
45 days.
Jump over to DK.
What's the bump period again?
Bump period?
Sorry, so I'm looking at the bump notice. Is there a time frame to respond to the bump?
Yes, there is a time
What does it
frame.
say? Oh, it's probably in
5 days.
the 22B, right?
Yes, it's within the
Ah,
22
Of course.
So when you're writing up an offer, you're submitting this with it at the time of the offer?
Correct. Yes, and you want to make sure you add it down to your addendas down below, so it's part of the purchase and sale.
But this is only for contingency offers.
Correct. Yeah, so if your buyer has to sell their property to purchase of this house, you need to include this in the purchase and sale. So contingency property notice, this is the 90K. Buyer's property sold, contingency satisfied. Buyer has accepted an offer to sell buyer's property that is not contingent on the sale or closing of another property, and that will close no less than 30 days and no more than 60 days from the buyer's date. From the date buyer accepted the offer or otherwise consented to by seller. For this notice to be effective, buyer must attach a copy of the complete purchase and sale agreement for the sale of buyer's property. If the sale of buyer's property fails to close, buyer must give notice to seller within 2 days as required by the buyer's sale of property contingency addendum form 22B. So if the buyer does receive an offer on a property, to send a copy over to the seller within 2 days.
Whether they accept it or not,
Could you repeat that?
whether they accept that offer or not.
Well, if they have mutual acceptance. So
Okay.
if they accept an offer and have mutual acceptance, they have to send this form within 2 days along with a copy of the purchase and sale. Failure to close and termination. Buyer hereby gives notice that the sale of buyer's property has failed or will fail to close. This agreement is terminated and the earnest money shall be refunded to buyer. Failure to close and reinstatement. Buyer hereby gives notice that the sale of buyer's property has failed or will fail to close. The contingency is in buyer's sale of property contingency addendum form 22B is reinstated until the contingency period expires. So let's say your contingency period is 60 days. After 45, you receive an offer on the contingent property, then you're at that 45-day period, that offer fails. Then you check that box and you go back to having those 15 days to sell your property.
In that same situation, if that happened, could you also choose to failure to close and terminate as a buyer? I mean, that's one of your options, right?
Based on what I'm reading here,
Even if there's time left on the contingency period and all that, is that a way out?
based on reading those two middle ones, based on failure to close and termination, if you were to
It's like
check
the
that,
it's the same situation as I'm reading it, but you have two options.
Mhm.
Terminate it or choose to reinstate it.
Correct.
Okay.
And that's the way I'm reading it as well. But I'll have to go in
Good
and,
question.
yeah, great
Always
question.
Maybe call that number on the list. They're always telling us to call.
Let me see if I have anything on here. Let's see if we can figure this one out. I don't have a copy.
It does to me, but
Yeah,
you kind of
on,
want to be sure if you're saying, hey, you got it out here and out here.
yeah, and on these notices, they don't have the one for the forms manual. That'll explain it better,
I can
unfortunately.
pull. Yeah, you can. Maybe they don't. You're right. That's what
Let's go to 22Q. So 22Q, buyer's pending sale of property contingency addendum. This agreement is contingent on the closing of the sale of buyer's property located at pursuant to the purchase and sale agreement dated. The complete purchase and sale agreement for the pending sale must be attached to this agreement. The term pending sale includes property that may be subject to inspection, feasibility, and or other contingency. 2, pending sale closing date. Buyer may not extend the closing date of the pending sale if such extension would delay the closing of this agreement without seller's prior written consent. Failure to close. If through no fault of buyer, the pending sale does not timely close, this agreement shall terminate and the earnest money shall be refunded to buyer. However, buyer may elect to waive this contingency by providing notice to seller of such waiver simultaneously with the notice that the pending sale failed to timely close. If buyer waives this contingency, then paragraph 5 below shall apply. 4, notice of failure to close. Buyer must give notice to seller within 2 days of learning that the pending sale has failed. Such notice must be given regardless of whether buyer chooses to proceed with this agreement. If buyer does not timely give such notice, then buyer shall be in default. Buyer's waiver. Buyer's waiver of this contingency constitutes the waiver of all other contingencies in this agreement, including without limitation, any inspection, financing, or other contingency. So with this form here, 22Q, let's say you already have your home on the market and you received an offer, and then you go write an offer on another property. You'll want to include this form with that, showing that your property is currently pending. So if for some reason your current pending property, let's say, fails due to financing, you can get out of your offer with the subject property.
So you only need this form if you've already got mutual acceptance on your listed property. You don't also need to include the 22B?
Couple ways you could do it. You could fill out the 22B and include this. Yeah, so you'll send in both at the same time when you write your offer, or send this one in by yourself.
So if you just include this one in your offer, would that property go to contingent or pending?
So the property, once you include this, you might go pending inspection.
Yeah,
You're gonna have an
okay, so-
inspection,
so
or
it
if there's
would be
no,
off the
or it'd
market.
be pending.
Yeah, so, okay.
Correct.
So this is a, so yeah, so that they would not be able to market the property anymore if you just included this one? For, like, just like a normal pending
Correct, yes,
inspection?
it would be like a normal.
Okay.
Yeah, and with my previous property, when I sold and bought, I just used this form, and this was years ago.
And they're not waiving anything with this form, the financing and the inspection?
No, not unless you're checking buyer's waiver, number 5. So once you waive the contingency, or which wouldn't necessarily you're disclosing, but once you waive that contingency, you're waiving all others, financing, inspection.
So I have a clarification between pending and contingent. When you're contingent, you can still market the property.
The seller can still market the property.
Meaning, as opposed to pending, you can't market it, meaning you can't say it's for sale, you can't do open houses, you can't do open houses.
You can still receive backup offers,
Yeah, you can do.
even though your property is currently pending.
Okay.
You could probably still have open houses if you wanted to.
Would this allow somebody to bump you though?
No, because once your property's pending,
Yeah. So it's a lot safer if you're representing the buyer to be able to do just this form. Because then your buyer can't get bumped.
correct. So this is, a lot of this is just an overview. Even for myself, I haven't used a contingent form in over a decade, unfortunately. But for the newer agents who've been in the business, let's say 8 months or less, you probably never knew what this form was, because no one was accepting contingent offers.
Right.
But in this market today, you're seeing a lot more.
We had one in not Oak Grove, but Ocean Shores that we had an offer on, and it was pending the sale of theirs, which fell through. So the seller's agent really was pushing for us to waive it. He was really pushing, which we didn't do.
Yes, and once you waive, you're putting your earnest money, or the buyer's earnest money is in jeopardy.
That's right.
So if they're willing to lose out on X amount of dollars, then it might be worth the risk, but that's up to your buyer to decide,
Right.
not us as agents to decide for them.
They tried to get us to agree.
Yeah.